corporate activities that you intend to get income tax, corporate tax. If you look at the analysis of revenue, you'll find that corporate tax is probably the major component. But then it means that if you are not creating that enabling environment, when you create it, it means you can get triple, quadruple that amount of money.
Mr. Boy, if I'm coming here, that part of borrowing, I do know that the Minister of Finance, we had an interview with her, and she talked about government working to reduce the local debt burden so that the private sector can have, I mean, the small and medium enterprise and other private sector people can have enough room to borrow from within. So they want to borrow outside. Don't you think that will be part of what they'll be looking at in 2018 to increase it?
Well, first, should I ask, did you believe that? Because look, it doesn't make sense for anyone, finance minister or whoever, to say that it's more difficult to borrow in my country, the cost of funds is so high, without interrogating why it's so high.
And dealing with that issue.
And dig into that issue and find out. But instead, you put your hands up, oh, this is the people in the banks in Nigeria, they charge too much interest. Who is in charge of the banks in Nigeria? Who is in charge of the control and management? You are. And you choose instead to say, we will go borrow outside. I ask you, which is more easy to manage? Debt that you take from a country where you control everything, they control the printing of the money and everything, or the debt that you incur using somebody else's currency, sovereign currency, so that at the end of the day, when you even expect that the 7% is cheaper, it turns out not to be very cheap after all. Because if you borrowed at a time, for example, when the Naira was, you borrowed $100 million, at a time, for example, when the Naira was 100 Naira to a dollar, you have no problem paying if the Naira remains at 100 Naira to a dollar. Yeah. But if the Naira becomes 300 Naira to a dollar, it means you have to find 3 times that 7%. You're talking of 21% now. Hello, is it much cheaper than local? No. And you also have the additional problem that now you are beholden to another sovereign entity who can then tell you what to do. Okay. It is chaos.
Mr. Francois, the alternatives here. See, the picture looks quite bleak. So let's look at what alternatives do we have. The politics and the realities. Or should I say the political economy and the realities on ground? And how do we maneuver through these waters?
Right, you're talking about alternatives. Well, let's stick to the budget. I was going to comment a little bit about the debt level that they are proposing. And I mean, we're talking about a deficit of about 25% this year. Last year was about 35%. There was a meeting in Niger, Niamey, I think, which the president attended about this West African single currency. And Nigeria tried to step it down. But if you look at the idea behind single currencies, as it obtains in Europe, in the Eurozone, for example, there are 2 things. We are mandated, if we're going to join this currency, to keep, a deficit to budget to deficit ratio at 4%. Nigeria is doing 25%. And we're also expected to keep inflation at about 5%. We're doing 16%. So we actually missed that opportunity to even begin to go into some level of economic discipline, if you like. The second thing I'd like to speak about really is, because I didn't get your question very well, but I want to hack back to something that Mr. Boyle said. Now, there's a misconception and there's a misreading of economics in Nigeria. I think we've been mistaught in universities. The other day, I did a search for the public sector size of many countries around the world. And I found out that the OECD countries, namely the US, UK, and co, they have an average of 21% of everybody employed in their countries in the public sector. The UK has about 15%. The US has about 15%, the UK has about 23%. Even South Africa here has about 17%. I realized that the countries with the lowest public sector size were actually in Africa. Madagascar has 2.8%. Mali has 4%. Nigeria has no data. And most of the people working in our public sector, the numbers they release to you, half of them is actually ghost workers. What it means to me is that the services, for example, that we need, we haven't even started. This economy hasn't started. We still have teachers teaching 200 people, 200 children in one class in our public schools. Therefore, everybody heads to the private schools. We still have very low doctor-to-patient ratio. We have very low police to citizens ratio. And most of the police are busy guarding big men and carrying people's handbags all over the place. So there's a need. If the government even says that they're not going to employ people this year, it is actually part of the downward spiral that we're talking about, a kind of vicious cycle of underdevelopment. This country is going down further when even countries around us, smaller countries, seem to be making some marginal progress. And that's a real problem. Perhaps that's the option that you're asking me to talk about this morning. I would say that where the budget fails usually is when they align the budget with crude oil. The only assumption that goes into our budget is crude oil price, $45, production per day, $2.3 million or $2.5 million as the case may be. And the government says it wants to diversify, but the biggest culprit in the non-diversification of the economy is actually the government from the budget circle. We would have wanted to see the figures, their projection on solid minerals, for example, at least the thing within their purview, their projections on tourism, their projections on all this other income that we say we're losing. We're not only losing taxes. Of course, the poor people don't want to pay taxes because they don't trust the government, but the big people also aren't paying taxes. There's a V8 going on now, the voluntary asset declaration and all of that. You know, and part of the text is that there are over 700 registered billionaires in Naira. There are over 700 registered billionaires in Naira. But only 20 people are paying taxes that show that they may be billionaires. Or rather, they're paying taxes over 20 million personal income tax. You know, so the rich people aren't cooperating. The poor people are not cooperating, and they're also being ground in the dust and all of that. And, you know, other countries are making progress. We should be alarmed enough to make a difference and to do things in a different way going forward.
Okay, Mr. Pastor.
Dr. Alafi, I'm sorry. Let's look at what he raised. The benchmark, $45, 2.3 million BPD, then exchange rate 305. We all know that you can't get a dollar 305 anywhere. So how are these projections going to work out?
Okay. Every